Good afternoon. So this is my first time in the Netroots Nation. I've heard great things, so let me try it again. Good afternoon. I got up at 4 a.m. to be here. So I need you to be more excited and give me some energy back while we go through this. First, let me say that I had a chance to watch the presentations from last year, and I'm a huge fan of both Deepak Bhargava and Elizabeth Warren, so I'm feeling a little bit of pressure standing in front of you, so hopefully you'll help me out with that. But more importantly, I kind of scratched what I was supposed to talk about because I was feeling even more pressure from my 6 kids. When I shared with them what I was going to talk about, they were like, well, that's all right. How much more time you have to work on that? Do you think people are going to get that? So I actually took away everything that I was going to talk about and changed it because I think based on what I've heard and some of the people that I've met, it's a much more relevant message than just being able to talk about money. Because what's wrong and what's happening in this country is not just about money, but it's really about people, it's about policy, and it's about power or the lack thereof. And so what I really want to talk about today is discuss how inequality affects lives, why inequality exists, how it is shifting and what's different, and hopefully offer some solutions that we can all build upon in this room. So how does inequality affect lives? Well, it affects everyone differently. For some, based on the economic recession, despite the recovery that they say is coming, inequality has manifested itself in lower pensions, declining stock portfolios, higher payments on their homes. But for others, it's manifested in even worse ways. It means homelessness, it means unemployment, it means poverty, and for some, it even means prison. When you have unemployment rates that are over 15% for African Americans, there's a problem. When you have home ownership rates that are only just above 40% for African Americans, even a little bit higher for Latinos, but yet over 70% for whites, we see that the inequality is becoming bigger and bigger. It's important for us, though, to not just start blaming people, but to recognize that the history of inequality has been legislated, and that actually continues. We see that specifically for African Americans, for Latinos, as well as for Asian Americans. And I want to take a minute to share some examples of that legislative inequality because it's significant. As someone who's got 2 degrees, I've never heard some of these stories. It was missing from my history class. So either we're not talking about it or we choose to act like we don't know, but it's clearly created the framework and the context for what we're facing today. So for African Americans, at the end of the Civil War, there was an opportunity to create a new starting line for us after slavery. And so you had the Freedmen's Bureau and you had the occupying Union Army that began to distribute land, and it was our 40 acres and a mule. But only 7 years later, they abolished the Freedmen's Bureau. And then you realize that all the land that we had went back to the landowners, which were predominantly white. And while sharecropping agreements were set up, it was a way to actually cap the ability of African Americans to earn wealth, to keep their land. It goes on in terms of what we have done in this country to continue to legislate and mandate inequality. We know that Latinos come from many countries with varied histories, but the United States still has the longest relationship with Mexico. Mexico won its independence in 1821. 3 years later, though, the United States passed the Monroe Doctrine, which said we would protect Mexico. We would protect it from the European powers. However, that doctrine actually allowed the United States to intervene on our behalf. We created a paternalistic relationship with the country, and it's continued to mean the dominance that we have now. In 1847, we went to war again with Mexico. We took over more land, over half of it. And then in 1848, we had the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, which gave the United States half of Mexico's land. We promised Mexican landowners that we would let them keep their land, but we know what happened. That was not the case. We reneged on our promise, we took back that land, and we did it through legislation. For the first time, we created racial categories that were used to determine who could obtain land. English language is established as the dominant language, and all land ownership papers and everything else was only done in English, legislatively mandating and creating cultural barriers by which we would continue to perpetuate inequality. And for Asian Americans, the same thing existed. A series of laws were created to begin to minimize and marginalize their opportunity and their wealth. The Chinese immigrants were drawn into the gold rush, which we often don't hear. And because of that, we created the foreign miners tax, which was designed to push them out. We created a tax of 25% that then allowed only those dollars to be used to subsidize government jobs and services, but those services were exclusively given to whites. It was one of the first tax-based racial transfers of wealth in this country, and it continued on and on. So we know that throughout history we have seen legislative mandates that have continued to support and maintain inequality in this country. The reality is while it may not be as bold through legislative mandates, it still exists, but it's a little less obvious. The obvious barriers that we continue to front are things like social capital. Many of you wouldn't be here. I clearly wouldn't be here if it wasn't for who we know, who knew someone, who knew someone. But if you grow up in Newark, New Jersey, or you grow up in New York City, and you go to public school and you can't afford to get a college education, you don't meet the people that I met at Georgetown. You don't meet people who went to Harvard. And therefore you've already experienced caps and limitations on your potential just based on social capital. We also have seen within the financial services industry, where I have spent most of my life, that other barriers exist. For example, why is it that you can only get the highest interest rate when you can put in the most money? I never understood that. Why is it that we have actually regulatory barriers that financial regulatory agencies enforce that actually limit the amount of money that can be lent or even placed in underserved communities? Why is it that we actually have legislation and asset requirements that limit our ability to even invest in clean energy? Things that we don't know, but subtleties that are having a huge impact in creating and perpetuating inequality. We also have seen more obvious shifts in inequality. Based on the historic examples that I gave, we saw that much of that was individuals against individuals. But now inequality runs a risk, and it's shifting, because inequality is now institutions against individuals. With Citizens United, we have more money at stake, and we have more systemic barriers to equality. We can see that now inequality has moved from just an issue about race and class, but about systems and institutions and individuals. So the question becomes, what are some of the solutions that we can begin to think about? And there are many. If we go back to what I believe is potentially an opportunity for us, it's that people plus policy equal power. People plus policy equal power. If we begin to engage people, and instead of the backstabbing and the criticism and the hanging people out to dry or throwing them under the bus, as my kids would say, we begin to identify the common values and the similarities that we all have. We are seeing a shift in many states across the country, some that we never would have thought of, where minorities are becoming the majorities. We're seeing that it's not just those that are already on the bottom that are suffering from this economic demise, but it's everyone. We have the greatest opportunity we've ever had to support and enforce solidarity amongst all people. It is no longer about the separation by race or by class, but the separation by the legislative mandates of those who have and those who do not. We have the opportunity to engage online and offline, at conferences and in communities. The revolution will not only be televised, but it will be on the web, it will be tweeted, and it will be happening in communities, and we're beginning to see that right now. So with people, we know that we have an opportunity, but then there comes policy. We need to shift the policies that we have and begin to remove the barriers and actually begin to also decrease the deficit. We begin to decrease that which continues to perpetuate the difference between the haves and the have-nots. We need many things that I know many of you talk about on a regular basis. Better regulation of the real estate and mortgage lending markets. We need a wealth tax surcharge on households with $10 million or more. And if we did that, we would actually save $300 billion a year. We need to eliminate the tax preference for capital gains. We have a system whereby Americans pay different rates. Americans who make more than millions of dollars a year only pay 15%. But I was surprised to find out that a police officer in my neighborhood in Bethesda, Maryland, ends up paying a tax rate of 35% or more. The capital gains tax rate should reflect the progressive nature of our income tax rate and rise as capital gains increase. We also need to support and invest in wealth development. We are very good at pilot programs, but we're not very good at scaling those programs. We don't invest in the long-term success and sustainability of those programs. Some of those include individual development accounts. Some of those also include things that we've had around forever, but we tend not to talk about, like the Earned Income Tax Credit or the Child Tax Credit. If we were to increase the use of the EITC and the Child Tax Credit, And we were able to provide a tax credit of up to $1,000 per child, not just to the poorest families, but to low and moderate income families. We can move 2 million children and 1 million parents out of poverty. The other thing is we need to fix our broken safety net. We need to modernize mean-tested benefits programs to develop a coordinated strategy that actually helps workers and families. We need to minimize the cliff effect. I don't know about you, but as I noted, I have 6 kids. And so thank goodness they're relatively spread out. But in the youngest twins, when I had to think about how I was going to be able to go to work and pay for childcare or send them to school, it was a huge leap. And luckily, I could afford it. But for someone who has just gotten a job, but still receiving income assistance to be able to put their kids in childcare, and if and when they make $5 or another $6 an hour, they're automatically dropped from that assistance, we all know they can't do both. The opportunity cost that we are placing in the hands of those that do not, we should be ashamed, because those decisions are not decisions that any American should have to be able to make. So when we talk about where do we go from here, and we talk about the opportunities that we have, we recognize that the goal is equality. And equality is achieved when what we look like or where we come from does not determine the burdens, benefits, or responsibilities that we bear in society. Equality includes opportunity, where everyone deserves a fair chance, whether you're at college or your work, whether you're gay or straight, whether you're young or old. We have security, when all people have the tools, resources, and access to institutions to support themselves and their families. And most importantly, when we have mobility, where everyone in our society has the chance to move forward in economic and educational status, whether you're from Pittsburgh, Petaluma, or Palo Alto. It really shouldn't matter. When we think about the opportunity that we have in breaking down the barriers to inequality, there is a recognition that too often we find ourselves fighting over things that at the end really don't matter. The opportunity to be able to leverage that which we have learned about unions and the power of collective action, to be able to leverage that which we heard from Goddess when people are engaged and met where they are in the local communities. The ability to amass from 1 to 10 to 1,000 to 1,000,000 is critical. And not just in terms of elections, but critical in terms of weight of how we manage media, of how we manage our messages, and of how we move people from the nots to the haves. When we think about policy, it's extremely important to recognize how policy takes place. It is not just determined during election cycles, but it emerges and it builds from grassroots actions, from grassroots communities. It gets passed because of case studies and stories like Ragad has talked about. When real people are identified with real issues, and politicians and legislators are able to see that there is indeed real solutions through policies that do not erect barriers, but policies that create pathways for equality. If we do that, then we have the opportunity to achieve power. But the one thing that I should say is that we know people plus policy equals power works. We know it works. We've seen it. We've seen it work for the right. We've seen it work for the Tea Party. We've seen it work for everyone else except ourselves. And so what happens with that and what comes with that is an ultimate responsibility, a shared responsibility and a community responsibility, that we will actually use our power correctly, appropriately, and allocate it equally. People can talk about 2012 or 2013. I'm 43 years old and my youngest twins are 4 years old. I respect that the right has spent 30 years working on this. I believe that we have an opportunity to shorten that time, but we need to do it now. This is the starting place for us to make that shift from inequality to equality. I ask and I'm humbled to be part of this group. I thank you for my first time invitation here. I hope that I'm able to come back and build upon the momentum that we have here today. The one thing that I would leave us with, and the challenge that I have for myself at Tides and for everyone in this room, is that we continue to work to achieve the community we desire, the policies we deserve, and the power that we so desperately need to break down the barriers to inequality. Thank you.